Okay. Is it going? Okay, thanks. Okay, so yeah, soldering is the process of combining two pieces of metal by melting another metal in between our two pieces and kind of fusing them together. So, in your little kit, your little Ziploc baggie you got from Ace, you should have 3 different wires, and these are your solder pieces. So, 3 different types. They all look exactly the same. So the only way you can tell the difference is by these little bends that are happening in the end. So they each have a different amount of bends in the end. Hard solder, that's the one we're always using first and most frequently. That has 3 bends in the end. So the more bends, the harder it is not to solder, but like the hotter temperature it needs. That's kind of what that implies. So 3 bends in the end, or like a square on the end of your wire, that's hard solder. That's what we're working with first. This solder, by the way, all of this is silver solder. So if you've soldered anything before, like electrical soldering or plumbing or like stained glass, that uses a soldering iron instead of a torch. Most of that solder has lead in it, so it melts at a really low temperature, like 400-ish degrees. This solder melts at a much higher temperature. So our hard solder, hard silver solder. If you try to buy solder like in a hardware store, they're gonna give you like really thick wire, and that's almost always has lead in it. That's not what you want. You want silver solder. That's like the general term for all of this solder. Each of these has a different percentage of silver, so that will change our melting temperature. So the hard solder, most bends in the end, melts at the highest temperature. It has the most silver in it. 75% silver, the rest copper and other metals. And it melts at like, I can't remember exact temperature, but it's like 1450, so 1400 degrees. And then we have medium solder, 2 bends in the end. For your samples, you're only going to be needing to use the hard. So, but this other will come into play when you are working on your project. And then the singular bend in the end is easy solder. And that melts at the lowest temperature. So it melts the fastest out of all of them. And that's kind of the last one we use. So we always start with the most bends. We start hard, highest temperature, and then as you build a more and more complex thing with more and more solder seams, you'll move down to the lower temperature. For your samples, only need to use hard. Most bends in the end, square. What am I thinking? So this solder, when we start to apply heat to it, is going to melt before our copper pieces melt, or our brass, or our nickel, or just pure sterling silver. The additional copper in this solder is going to cause it to melt earlier than all of our metals. It's going to become a liquid. It's going to suck into our seam if we do everything right. And then when we remove our torch, it will harden back into solid metal and essentially fuse our 2 pieces together. It's very fun. Okay, so that's kind of like the overview of soldering. We're going to work our way through this little sheet. We're not going to do all 6 of them. There's one on the back. So you're going to be doing 6 samples total. And we'll kind of talk more about like the specifics of craftsmanship later, but let's just start with the first one, a T-joint. So whenever you, I can't remember which pieces I cut for that. All of this is going to be scrap metal, you guys. So you're welcome to use any scrap metal. They're all pretty much the same. I would just suggest using copper since it's kind of slightly the easiest to solder. Not noticeably, but slightly. And anytime I'm soldering, I want to be using my tray with refractory material in it. That's going to not catch on fire. Adjust. Adjust. I'll turn in a minute the lights off once we get a little closer. Okay. So for our T-joint, there's one very important rule to soldering. This solder, when it melts, becomes a runny liquid. Super runny. Other types of solder are thicker and they kind of blob up on themselves. You can like build up solder. This type of solder, silver solder, does not blob up on itself. So it will not fill if you have a gap. It will never fill if you have a gap. So, in order to prepare my pieces for soldering, the first one is a T-joint. So, there will be a flat bottom piece and then a piece that is perpendicular to my bottom piece. So that's kind of what my T-joint is going to look like. So I cut my pieces on the shear in the back room. Not this shear. This shear curves your metal. It curls it up and kind of roughens the edge. The other shear keeps your metal nice and flat. So I need these two pieces to be touching completely with no light coming through. So I chopped it on the shear and then I filed this edge that is going to be sitting on this surface. And I'm going to double check it. If I hold it up to the light, I shouldn't be able to see any light coming through. So there should be like literally no gap. If your piece has a little bit of curve to it, use a hammer, flatten it out. 0 gaps. And by gap I mean like literally the tiniest little gap. It's worth it to get to like file it into the bottom of this edge into a perfect flatness so there's no gap. That saves you time in the long run. It is sometimes infuriating while you're doing it, but it's worth it. It will save you a lot of time in the end. Okay, so I have my two pieces of metal ready. They're also clean. And if you had plastic on the back, you took that off because that will melt when I start torching it. So clean. They don't really need to be sanded yet because I'm going to have to do a lot of sanding later. Eventually when you get good at soldering, you'll sand first and then like not really need to do any cleanup sanding. But at this point, that's not really realistic. So they don't need to be sanded, but they should be clean, free of tape, plastic, paper, gunk of whatever type. Okay. Now, I need a third hand. So, as I'm soldering, I want my pieces to be in the exact perfect position before I really start. And that piece is not going to stand up by itself. So we have, I don't know where they all went, I'll find them. This is a third hand. It's just a pair of tweezers that will kind of hold your metal up for you. So this piece will stand up before I solder, while I'm soldering, and I am not holding it with my hands or with tweezers, but everything should kind of be set up before you start. The way these are all cross-lock tweezers, which means you have to push down here in order to get the top to open. And that way when you let go, it will like be clamping down on your metal for you. So I want to push back here and grab my, what am I doing? Piece. And these things usually like involve some finagling. If they don't touch, you kind of have to like bend them together. They're kind of crusty. There's my flat filed side, and I want that to be touching my bottom piece. Preferably, I want this to be at 90 degrees and not like at a weird angle. Okay, so before I start, also I want to check and make sure that there is no light coming in between them. A lot of times when you use the third hands, they can kind of shift and like pull up your metal while you're not noticing it. So just double check and make sure your pieces are touching. Sometimes it helps to hold your piece down and then grab like higher a little bit than where the tweezers naturally sit, and then it's kind of like pushing your top piece down into your bottom. Okay, so if I just start trying to solder this right now, it will go through kind of that same heat patina color range and then turn black and gross. I don't know if any of you guys got to the black and gross stage, but your metal does not like to solder when it is dirty. So if I just start trying to do this right now, it's not going to work. Before I solder anything, I need to apply flux. So this is our flux. It is usually up there. There's like above the sink. There's a big one up there. Just handy flux on it. There are little medicine bottles in like the drawer back there. It's open right now. In the little cubby hole back corner. A bunch of these, so you can like scoop some out with, I think there's like a knife and a spoon over there, and put it in here just to keep some at your desk. So this is like white, pasty consistency. This is what it looks like. Can you guys see that? This stuff is water-based, so if the lid stays off, it will all dry up into like a hard brick. But if you add some water and like crunch it all up and dissolve, you can dissolve it back into this paste. A little shaky. That's what you want. And this flux is going to keep our metal clean as we start heating it up. So it won't go through the heat patina colors and it won't turn black. But this is going to help it from oxidizing, which is what the black, it turning black, building up a dirty layer on is called. I probably should have done this before I put them together. I want, different people have different like opinions on this, but I like to flux my entire pieces, all the sides, all the edges, everything. At the very least, you need to do like the parts that are touching and like a little bit around there, so that basically your seam is going to stay nice and clean. So that's kind of up to you if you want to do the whole thing or just your seam, but you have to at least do your seam. A few notes about the flux. It is toxic in that like you shouldn't eat it. So after you have been using it, wash your hands. It's not super toxic, like you don't need. Someone last semester asked me how many hours she should wait after she washes her hands to eat. You can eat right after you wash your hands.
Tell her 24 to 48.
Yeah.
Shut up.
2 weeks. Just don't lick it off of your fingers, basically.
So if you were to do a patina to that, should you do the patina before doing the flux, or is the flux going to be able to come off and then you can do it later?
The patina would be your very last step. So soldering, you'll like get everything soldered and then sand it and then patina. Yeah. Okay, so I have everything. Also, like getting everything set up is half of the battle. Is half of the hardest part. I do say everything is the hardest part. But really, it's important to get it lined up because if it's like soldered a little bit off, then you just have to redo it. So getting it lined up perfectly, making sure that it's touching perfectly now is the best option. Okay, so I flux everything. Don't eat it. It hurts if you get in your cuts. So if you have a cut, put a Band-Aid on first. It can get on your clothes. It won't do them any harm. It just leaves white gunk on your clothes. That's all about flux. Okay, so now I want to cut my solder. Hard solder. All of these should start with hard. And anytime you're starting any new project, hard solder. So this is not going to stay there. I'm going to put this right there. Maybe you can see. I'm cutting like very small pieces of solder. And by pieces, I mean specks. Like, can you see that? So small. You can't even see it. It's on there. See it? Speck. Right where that sun is. Here. I'll pass them around. Speck. Speck size. If you're doing a really big seam, you can cut slightly larger pieces. But in general, speck. Because this is going to melt into a puddle, into a liquid. So if you kind of think about the size of our seam, you don't really need that much. Whoops. You also don't need to put them on paper. I just wanted you to see them. It's not working very well. They're rolling away. Okay. For your samples, I didn't really tell you what sizes of pieces of metal you should be using, but 1 inch or smaller, like about the size I'm working with. The bigger you get, like the trickier soldering is. So for your very first tries, about a 1 inch piece of metal. Can be a little smaller. If it's really tiny, then it also gets harder. But so like 1 inch to a 1/2 inch generally is a good place to be. Okay, so I cut a bunch of solder and now I want to put it on my seam. Tweezers? You should have tweezers in your drawer. Those are usually the best way. Whoops. Man, you can't see that at all, can you? Oh, well. I'm gonna make you guys come up and look at it in a second. Okay, so it's easiest to use the tweezers. If you use your fingers, like the solder is gonna stick to anything that has like a little bit of moisture, and your fingertips have a little bit of moisture on them. So the solder likes to stick to your fingers instead of sticking to your metal. It's very frustrating. And my goal is to put them on there carefully and gently so that I don't move the pieces that I very carefully set up. But my goal is generally, like with this size little pieces, to put them about like 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch apart.
How many pieces is that?
That's 5. Uh-oh. Can you see them? Kind of. Those middle two are hard to see. Oh, well, let's try. Okay. once I have my flux on there and my solder on there, then I'm ready to start soldering. Yeah, we'll do this first one, and then the next one I'll make you stand up and look at. So, again, both of your things need to be facing towards you, underneath your desk, to let the gas out and the air out. So the torch for soldering is a little bit different than for your heat patina. So for your heat patina, you had real baby flame, right? Because you didn't need to get your metal very hot at all. But we need to get like up to 1400 degrees. So a little bit bigger of a flame. So more gas and also more oxygen. There's kind of a few different strategies for your torch depending on what exactly you're trying to solder. But in general, you want to use a flame like this, which is called a reducing flame. So it has those little flickery orange tips at the end, right? What that means is that your flame has a little bit too little of oxygen, not quite enough oxygen, so it is like sucking it out of the air. And that's good for soldering because that means it's sucking the oxygen away from your metal, which helps keep your metal clean, which helps soldering go easier. So little orange tips, and versus like this kind of flame, small, pointy, and loud. Little blue cone inside of the big blue cone. Can't see it on there. Okay. This is an oxidizing flame, so it has more oxygen, and it will actually like add oxygen to your piece, so it makes it dirtier. The only time you need to use that type of flame is when you're doing a really big piece. That type of flame is way hotter. An oxygen-rich flame, the blue cones and the loud noise is way hotter than this. So I want reducing little orange glittery feathery tips, and then I can start soldering. So I'm gonna go out again. You see it? Is it better without the lights on it? Oh. I'll make you stand up next time. Okay. So the way that you heat up your metal is also important. This is probably like the hardest part. No, the two trickiest parts are getting your pieces lined up perfectly and touching perfectly with no gaps, and then to heat up your piece correctly. So my goal is to heat up both pieces of metal evenly, the flat one and the vertical one. It is harder to heat the flat one up because I can only reach like one side of it with my flame, whereas the vertical one I can reach all around it except for like that very bottom edge. So it's going to be much easier to heat up the vertical piece than the flat piece, and I need them to heat up evenly. My goal here is not really to melt the solder, but is to get the metal up to the temperature where the solder melts and like sticks to it. So if I just melt directly at my solder, it will melt into a little ball. But if my metal's not hot enough, it will stay in a ball and it won't like suck to the surfaces of my pieces, which is what I want. This will make more sense when you're doing it, I promise. Okay, so my goal is to heat up bottom piece and vertical piece evenly. So my bottom piece needs more attention. So I'm going to go kind of straight down for this T-joint at least at my bottom piece of metal. These bricks are refractory, so they kind of reflect heat, they bounce it back. So my vertical piece is going to get heated up just by like the bounce off flame, if that makes sense. I don't know if you guys can see when I move my torch away, it's starting to change color a little bit, so that means that it's getting hotter. In general, once you have your torch in the right place, you want to leave it there and not move it around too much. Every time you take your torch away, your metal is losing heat, and you want it to retain heat, and you want it to get even hotter. So kind of find a good place and leave your torch there, especially when you start doing bigger stuff. So the flux kind of goes through a few stages that lets you know when your metal is getting hot, and we already went through them, so I'll tell you about it next time. But you can kind of maybe see my metal is like starting to really barely glow, like, because it's so hot. A dull red. Like, when I take it away, it kind of turns black. Oh, I forgot to tell you. The tip of the bottom of the torch, the end of the flame, is the hottest point. So that's another thing that people have trouble with when it's taking a while. They get like closer in, and that's actually less hot. So it's kind of just intuition to put your torch closer, but you want to keep it so the end of your flame is touching your metal. My solder is starting to get a little bit shiny. I don't know if you can see that on that screen or not. But right before my solder melts, it'll kind of get shiny, and then it'll ball up in a little ball. And then once it melts, it will like collapse into a puddle. So we're getting there. I'm going to turn my torch up just a little bit because I get impatient sometimes. If you're having trouble, sometimes it also helps to kind of go at a little bit of an angle so that you're heating up, your like bouncing off flame is heating up the rest of the metal. Sometimes I like to heat it up from the edge like this, but I moved it a little bit. There it goes. Can you see it? So when it melts, it'll melt into a like shiny, shimmery little line into a little puddle. And ideally, I want that shiny, shimmery line the entire length of my seam, on both the front and the back. So sometimes I'll also heat it up from the back and try to get the solder to like pull all the way. Oh no, you can't see. Try to get it to like pull through to the back. The one nice thing about copper is that you can't really melt it. So for like our silver rings, if you heated it up too much, your silver can melt into a ball, but your copper is not going to do that. Okay, so I saw this shiny shimmery solder line, my solder melt into a puddle the entire length of my seam on both sides. If you can't get it to do both sides, you can kind of like, you can always re-solder reapply heat, add more solder. So if it's not perfect the first time, then you can always fix it later.
Did you put solder on like the little pieces on both sides?
I just put them on one side.
Okay.
If you want to, you can like do both if you want to.
Okay. Did it like get on the other side because you had to adjust the metal, like the angle, or like will it just do that?
It will just do that.
Okay.
Yeah, if you heat up like kind of the back or wherever you didn't put the solder, if you get it hot enough, it'll like solder runs to wherever is the hottest. So if you get this side hot enough, it will like suck underneath your seam to the other side. It's kind of like when they prick your finger, right, and then put the little tube and then your blood sucks up into the tube. Capillary action, same thing, but more fun, less gross. Okay, so now my metal is like very dirty and gross. And at this point you can't always tell like if you did a good job or not. So I'm going to clean this thing off. After you have been soldering, these tweezers, the tongs, the third hands are going to be super hot. So don't touch them with your fingers. You can use your tweezers to, or even your copper tongs to kind of squeeze those and open them up. And now I have my two little pieces. Just because they're stuck together right now does not mean they're like actually soldered. The flux becomes like glass and kind of like a glue. So we need to get our flux off and clean this off to tell whether or not like it's actually soldered together. Can you turn that light back on? So the way we're going to do that is to put it in the pickle. The pickle is a mild acid solution that will eat off all of the flux and all of this black oxidation, clean your metal off to be back to like pure, beautiful copper. So the pickle solution is in all of the crock pots, which there's only a couple of out right now, but we can make more. So I put some in this one. There are a couple little ones like spread out on the desks, and then there's that one bigger one. You guys are welcome to use any of them. This is a new fresh batch, so it's clear. It just looks like water. It works best if it's hot, which is why we put them in crock pots. So this one's steaming. That's pretty. Yeah, but so it looks like water. There it is. Water. Clear. Like I mentioned, very mild acid solution. It is sodium bisulfate, in case you care, which is used in pools to regulate the pH. So it's not like a dangerous acid. It's not going to burn you or hurt you unless it's just hot, like this is hot. But you can put your fingers in it. It's not going to like scar you. It will, however, eat holes in your clothes. So don't splash it on yourself because you'll get little itty bitty holes in all of your clothes. So I want to drop this in there, and it's going to eat off all of the gunk. When you guys do that, use your copper tongs. These guys. You should have some in your drawer, your own personal pair. The steel tweezers, if those go into the pickle, then you change the chemical solution so that anything that goes in there afterwards gets plated in copper, which is like if you're making a silver ring, not a good thing because then you have a copper ring. So yeah, make sure that you are using your copper tongs and not your steel ones. If you accidentally use your steel ones, just let me know. We can make a new batch of the pickle. In a few weeks I'll teach you how to make your own so you don't have to rely on me anymore. But depending on how dirty that is and how strong my pickle is, it will take like 10 minutes to clean up, sorry. If you get flux or pickle in your eyes, you should use the eye wash, by the way. Sorry. It actually really only leaves hole in your clothes if you like leave it. So if you take like 2 weeks to do your laundry. I spilled a whole thing on my shoes. They're in pretty bad shape right now, but they're okay. I washed them right away. Okay, so that's our first joint, P joint. We're gonna leave it in there and let it clean off and see what it looks like when it's clean. So what time is it? We'll probably do like 2 more here. Let's do the butt joint. So this one, your 2 pieces are kind of overlapping to form a right angle. And it's very similar to your miter joint, which is the 4th one down. But the 4th one down is, the pieces are filed to an angle to match each other. So it's kind of one sheet that's like filed and then folded. And the butt joint is 2 different pieces of metal that are kind of overlapped to make a right angle rather than like meet to form the perfect angle, if that makes sense. So, same kind of process. Flux everything up. By the way, the reason we're doing these 6 different types of solder seams is because these are the 6 main ways to attach pieces to like build larger 3-dimensional forms. So you can pretty much build anything using these different types of joints. So yeah, for this one I want to find, I kind of have 2 options. I can put this piece on top of this one, right on the edge. Or I can put it like on the edge of the bottom piece, if that makes sense. I like to do it on top. Your brick is probably hot by now, so be careful touching it. Also, ideally, I want my third hands to like be as far away from the seam as possible. I don't want to like put them right in the, like way down here, right in the way of my seam. These are made out of steel, and steel is kind of a heat sink, so it will like suck up any heat and it will suck it away from our seam and make soldering harder. So sometimes that's like helpful to use steel in some places, but for this, where I want my whole seam to solder perfectly, I want to keep those as far away from my seam as possible. So just try to hold like the tippy top of your piece, if possible, as close as you can. Okay, so those are lined up to form, the top piece is right on the edge of my bottom piece to form a right angle. And then some solder. Putting your solder on can be a good indication if you add too much coffee or not. So your hands are shaky. Okay. Whoops. And I didn't mention this last time, but I want to push my solder like right up on the edge. I want my solder to be touching both pieces of metal at the same time. So when they melt, that's kind of like a good little push for them to go into the seam. If they're like away from the seam, they'll just melt all over the surfaces of your metal. And in the end, your good craftsmanship for solder seams is to have solder like literally only in your seam and not on the surfaces of your metal. So you'll be filing and sanding solder off of the surfaces wherever it like spreads out. So your goal is only in the seam. So if I shove these right against, like right up in there, so they're touching both pieces, that kind of helps my chances there. Okay. Not better. Will you guys come look at this? Up close, relax. You can't really see it up there. That's kind of what you want it to look like. My flux is already dry. Again, it's water-based, and my brick was hot. So all the water has already evaporated, which is why it looks white, like more white. When you put it on, it will be a little more transparent than that. And it's totally fine if your flux dries before you start soldering. Not a problem. Whoops. Okay. Actually, will you guys just stand up this whole time? Get in here as close as you can, so you can see this happening. Also, generally, not a great idea to have paper around when you're soldering. Just kind of keep that in mind. Okay. Little flattering orange tips. And if and when you need to make it hotter, you're just going to add more of both. So a little more gas, a little more oxygen. Okay. It's also, since my flux dried, you can't really see the stages, but I can explain them to you. The first thing that's going to happen is that here, maybe we can see it. Nope. I'll do this one. So that's kind of what it looks like to start with. Like pretty clear and transparent. The first thing that's going to happen is that your water will evaporate. So it's called the popcorn phase. It turns white and it gets all, like, pops up a lot. Generally, I want a very thin coating of flux, because if I have a lot of flux, when the water evaporates, it can, like, it'll pop. It pops when the water evaporates, and it can move my solder out of the place where I put it so carefully. Like, this little piece is no longer touching the back, so I need to put it back where it belongs. I'm right-handed, so I usually hold the torch in my left hand, and then some tweezers in my right hand so I can adjust carefully. I'm really shaky today. It also helps when you're trying to adjust if you like rest your hand against something, so then you have some stability. If you just try to do this like, right, very shaky. Okay. Kind of once your flux gets, so after the white and bubbly, it turns like clear and glassy. So this one right now is kind of to that stage of being clear and like glassy. By glassy I just mean like shiny. So it goes from being like solid white matte to like super shiny clear. Once it gets super shiny clear, that's usually an indication that your metal is starting to get hot enough. It's like almost hot enough. So again, most of my heat is focused at the bottom piece, and I'm not like in here at the top piece, right? Most of my heat's focused at the bottom, and now it's about to melt. That first little one melted already. Not completely, but just a tiny bit. Oops. There it goes. So can you see it? Shiny, shimmery, little. It like shoots all the way down the seam. At some point, you'll have dreams of it. It's like when you're falling, but you'll see the solder just go. That's when you know you're something. Okay, so once I see that shiny, shimmery line the whole way across with no little black gaps, anywhere there's still black, there's like a hole there, and I want the entire seam to be filled in. So can you see it? Can you guys see it? Shiny, shimmery line. Whoops. Don't do that. Shiny, shimmery line. See it? It's like a river. Okay, so then I am done. At least until I check it and make sure it looks good. Almost touch those, don't touch them. So, because I moved it, it stopped touching it and therefore did not attach. Like, at this point, if it like does not work, you kind of just get to start again, and you'll get to experience that most likely during these samples. So metal does not like to solder. That's dirty, so I just need to clean this off. Also, when you go straight from the block to the pickle, this metal is really hot. Again, don't touch it with your hands. It was just at like 1400 degrees. Like I told you guys, the flux acts like glue. So right now my piece is stuck to this brick and it's not coming up. If that happens to you, just like prying is not the best choice because then it can fly. So if I start to heat it up again, my flux will get sticky as it warms up, and I'll be able to get it off of there. Yeah, if you drop it straight in there from your brick, it's super hot. So putting it straight into the pickle is called quenching, which is essentially just changing the temperature from like 1450 to whatever the temperature of the wire is. So yeah, as soon as you drop it in the water, it will cool immediately to the temperature of the water. And it usually like bubbles and sizzles really loudly, so don't be scared. It goes like, it boils all the water around it until it reaches the temperature of the water in like milliseconds, which is cool. But yeah, so that is that. If it doesn't work, I'm just gonna wait until my metal is clean and then do it again. If I have solder in my whole seam, I can kind of just remelt the solder that's already there, but sometimes you'll need to add extra. Okay, so here's my first one. Your metal does come out like a little pinker at first than it was originally. It's still a little bit dirty up here at the top. There's like some black gunk. Up. Black gunk. When you take it out of the pickle, rinse it off in water. I just brought some over here because I didn't want to be lazy. And then usually once I take it out of the pickle, I will brass brush it to kind of get off all of this like gunk, and that kind of helps you tell if it's totally clean. So this one's still dirty. That pink stuff is oxidation. It just needs to like be removed more. So yeah, we'll leave this one in there a little longer. And let's do, you guys have questions so far? We're gonna leave the sweat joint for later. That's a little more complex. There's a few steps involved in that one, same as the miter joint. So we could do wire to sheet. So again, for this one, I'm going to flux my bottom piece. Doesn't matter what size or shape your bottom piece is. But yeah, if you want to construct, you can build forms both out of sheet and wire, or a combination. So for your wire to sheet, I would suggest using the thickest gauge of wire we have, the thickest wire. Because the smaller your piece of metal is, the faster it gets hot. And my goal is to heat up both metals evenly, right? So if I use a really tiny skinny wire, it's going to like get hot immediately. It's going to make this hard. So thick wire, whatever type of metal you want. And then I need to file the end of this so that it's perfectly flat. So that when it sits on this flat piece, there are no gaps underneath of it. Ideally, sitting down is a little bit better way to do this. Then I want to flux this guy. You guys are welcome to use like whatever bricks on your thing you want to. Doesn't really matter. I like to find the flattest spot possible, just a little easier. If all of your bricks are really, really, really gross and really uneven, you can take them out to that little landing outside the door, and it will flatten into a beautiful, smooth surface. So, that's an option, if all of your bricks are gross.
You don't even have like a full brick.
It's okay if you don't have a whole brick, but you need at least a flat spot. So if you don't have a flat one, we can find you one. Okay, so same kind of process. Make sure these aren't hot before you touch them. Tweezers as far away from your seam as possible, and I want to make sure my wire is touching my metal. So a lot of times when you clamp it in there and you let go, again, it kind of pulls off the surface a little bit. So make sure that they're touching and that when you let go, it doesn't move at all. Whoops. So if you clamp a little bit higher, it kind of forces it down into your bottom piece. And for this I only need like one piece of solder, because like a little baby piece. The seam I'm trying to cover is so small. Just really like the end of that wire. So I just want to shove that right up against the wire and the bottom piece. And then I can go. Okay, so there's my popcorn phase, white, popping around, bubbly. And as it gets hotter, it will start to turn clear. Again, your wire is smaller, so it needs less heat. It's also vertical, so it needs less heat. So my goal is to aim like only at the bottom. You really don't need to hit the wire at all because it's getting those bounce back flames. And I think people have the most difficulty with this one because they just heat their wire up way more. So all their solder will jump to their wire instead of like sucking in between their pieces. So heat up, you don't even have to like, you can just heat up the corner. You can kind of heat up mostly brick. One of the main parts of soldering is just like learning to see where your flame is hitting, since they're kind of like hard to see sometimes. Okay, it's about to melt, if you haven't seen it yet. There it goes. So it melts into a little, and I should see that little like shimmery line all the way around the circumference of my wire. In general, once you see that shimmery line, you want to stop soldering, because as you continue to heat up your pieces, your solder will just like spread out forever. Which is okay, except that you have to sand way more. Okay. It's fun, guys. Let's see what these look like. Okay, so I'll pass this one around. I'm like, if your whole entire solder seam isn't filled in, then you need to like either only just reheat it and kind of suck it through, or you might also need to add more solder. So if you look at this one, the front side where I put all my solder, it is completely filled in. There might be one little tiny gap there at the end. But on the back, you can only see like a little section has the silver line in it. So I need all my seams, like both sides, to be completely filled in with no gaps. So if I need to resolder, if I have any gaps, then I can just reflex that and either remelt the solder I have or also add more. Here's another example. This one's the miter joint, which we'll do later. But if you look at the end where there's like a little, I marked it in Sharpie, there's like a little negative space. If there's like any black in your seam, that means that it's a hole and that you need to fill it in. So this T-joint, I'll pass this around. This one's good. You can see the solder seam on both sides, solder the complete length of the seam, that little shiny silver line. If I needed to re-solder, again, I'm going to reflux and reset up with my tongs. You do have to kind of be careful with your tongs when you set it up the second time. So again, you want to make sure, like, hold your piece down, grab a little like up towards your finger and then let go. So it's kind of pushing your top piece down into the bottom. Do you guys know what I mean by that? Okay. If these are wanting to like spring up, when the solder melts, it will just like lift your top piece off of your bottom one. So hold your piece down and kind of grab up high so that when you let go, it's pushing down into your block. That's a good one. Later, and if like not today, maybe not even next class, or maybe next class, we're going to talk about like cleaning these up, so how to like finish them well. But your first step before you finish them well is just to have solder the entire length of your seam that shows on both sides. Any questions?
When are these due?
I haven't decided when they're due. I'll get back to you. I'm thinking on Thursday, but maybe not.
Next week?
Yes, sorry. Yeah. Not next class. Let's just do one more, and then we'll do the last two next week. I mean, next class. Is that what I said? edge to edge. We're doing the back one. This is basically whenever you put two pieces side by side. So it can be like two flat pieces side by side like this, which is kind of what the drawing shows. Two pieces edge to edge. However, it's like the main construction technique for anything that will become round, except a sphere. But like a cylinder or a cone, both of those are made the edge to edge construction. So if I was making this into a cone, I would like hammer it until it became round, which we'll talk about later when we get to like making your projects. But then I'm going to do this edge to this edge. So that's an edge-to-edge solder seam is how you'll make a cone or a cylinder straight in towards each other. Also, if you're making a ring or have made a ring before, same process. So at this point, it does not matter that your thing is round. Your main goal is for your two ends to come straight in towards each other. So I don't want it to be like this, flat in towards each other on whatever you're making. So for your sample, you're going to get like a strip of metal. I would suggest a decently skinny strip, small, nothing like the wider it is, like this is way wider than this, the harder it is. So this is about 2.5, 3 millimeters. That's a good starting place. We'll talk more about like forming metal, so like shaping it with hammers later when we start your project. But for this sample, you're just going to use your flat pliers in your drawer. And I'm going to grab the inside of my ring and flip it, or I guess it's not a, it's kind of a ring. Flip it straight in. And then same for the opposite side, flip that straight in. So I want my two ends end to end, perfectly in a flat line, not a circle. But I want the entire surface, I guess I should have mentioned this first. Both of these ends are filed perfectly flat before I started this. So I cut my little strip, I filed my ends perfectly flat, like totally perpendicular to my edges. So all of the corners are 90 degrees. Again, the thinner your piece of metal is, the easier it is to get them perfectly flat. So for your sample, skinny little piece. You can also use a wire if you would like. Okay, so straight in towards each other, maybe. Flat. Straight flat top. It's way too dark. Okay. I'll pass it around. Straight in towards each other. Again, no gap. So if I hold it up to the light, there should be no light coming through those two ends touching. Art should be touching completely. If you're having trouble doing that, a good way to, I don't have an extra one, that would have been smart. If you use your pliers and kind of push one end past the other one so they overlap, you can pull them back into place, and that will have some like tension pushing the two ends against each other if you're having trouble closing that gap. Okay. So this is going to be the same process. I'm going to flux everything. For that, like, that's a pretty small seam, so I probably just need one piece of solder, maybe two. You can always use more solder, it just involves more sanding later. So, I'm not a fan of sanding. Almost. Okay, flux. Flux the whole thing. I can either just kind of let it like balance itself somewhere, or again I can use the third hands. I can even do it flat like this if I want to. I like to do it with the seam facing up so I can see what's happening. Oh. Okay, solder right on the seam. Again, I know that's right where my crack is, so it's touching both sides, right in the crack. And by in, I mean on top of, actually, not literally in between the two pieces. Whoops. Okay, so this seam, same principles apply, but it kind of manifests a little bit differently. So I need to heat up, again, both sides of my seam evenly so that my solder sucks down in between them. So, can you guys see that now? So I want to go straight down. Did I knock it off? And back and forth. So I'm heating up this side and this side evenly. Straight down, back and forth. Until my solder melts into a puddle. It's almost there. There it goes. Okay. So I have a problem. My solder all melted to one side and not in between them. At this point, if that happens, if you really want to, you can clean it off. But if you act quickly, you can kind of adjust now. So I'm gonna add another piece on there. And it's kind of dirty. It's pretty dirty. It's black. It's not a great sign, but sometimes you can kind of fix it now. So I'm just going to add one more piece, and it keeps melting to that side, so I want to heat up this side a little bit more. Because clearly I'm not heating them evenly, even though I think that I am. Dang it, I did it again. Okay. Also, one other trick. When your solder is liquid, sometimes with your tweezers you can like smear it. Spread it. So that's not like a technical thing. That's a trick. So mine was only on one side, and then I kind of like smeared it across with my tweezers, and then I got it to suck in the seam. You have to be careful when you're doing that. Again, your tweezers can get like very, very hot. I wouldn't suggest it for the larger seams, but sometimes on these little seams, if you're having trouble, that can be a good trick. Okay. Any questions? Starting to lose my voice. So let's be done for now. Last main thing. These things get really hot. Once you've used them a lot, really even just after you've used them once. So just to be aware of like your body and moving around them, and don't like reach over them, because you'll burn yourself and you'll have a scar forever. So yeah, these stay really hot. Pretty much everything is hot, so just as you're going through, be aware and be careful. Tweezers get hot, third hands get hot, torch gets hot, everything gets hot. Don't burn yourself. Yeah, so we're gonna finish the last two on Thursday, next class.